very high-profile government figures, the Deputy Prime Minister of Quebec and the British Trade Commissioner. The Deputy Prime Minister was later assassinated in captivity. In response to this, the Prime Minister of Canada of the time, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, got the Governor General to declare basically a form of martial law, giving the government the power to arrest and detain without cause anyone suspected of being an FLQ sympathizer, which they did in large numbers. And this triggered a significant backlash on the part of the French-Canadian middle class, who saw this as a preposterous overreaction. Anyway, it is a very long and very interesting story, but as you can see, it is still a sore spot with French Canadians to this day. The other thing Tom referred to is an event that the Quebecers rather insensitively call the Night of the Long Knives. In the early 1980s, Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau significantly revised the Canadian Constitution in a bunch of ways we won't get into now. But after much negotiation, 9 of Canada's 10 provincial governments agreed to these changes, but one province did not. This was not legally relevant because there was nothing in the rule book that said that Pierre Elliott Trudeau had to get the unanimous consent of every province in order to change the Constitution. But it has led to this mythology in Quebec that the modern Constitution of Canada is in some moral way illegitimate because the government of Quebec never formally assented to it back in the 1980s.
Mais bon, tout ça c'est le passé, mais qu'en est-il de leur plateforme électorale actuelle? Donc dans les grandes lignes, le parti est pro-environnemental, il reconnaît l'urgence climatique, il veut que le Canada soit carboneutre d'ici 2050. Toutes des bonnes choses. Il veut réduire les impôts des très pauvres, de ceux qui gagnent moins de 15 000 $. Il veut donner un meilleur accès aux médecins de famille, baisser les coûts des services de garde. Bref, plein de choses pour lesquelles je suis assez d'accord. Sauf que dans les faits, le problème, c'est que Justin Trudeau, c'est un peu une marde hypocrite et c'est peut-être quelque chose sur lequel on peut être d'accord, toi et moi, JJ. Il veut à tout prix être centriste et plaire à tout le monde, ce qui, dans les faits, mène rarement à quelque chose, surtout dans un pays comme le Canada où la cohésion nationale, c'est un concept assez discutable, disons. Genre comme JJ et moi on a pu le montrer, il y a quand même pas mal de différences idéologiques entre un conservateur de la Colombie-Britannique et un progressiste du Québec. Et dans le fait qu'il essaie d'être centriste à tout prix, ben Justin Trudeau a pas le choix d'être hypocrite sur plein d'enjeux, comme par exemple l'environnement, où d'un côté il déclare l'urgence nationale, mais de l'autre côté il investit des milliards de dollars dans le pétrole. À un moment donné, choisis ton camp.
I do agree, basically, with what Thomas is saying here. Trudeau and the Liberal Party in general can sometimes be a bit of a ink blot, where people on the left see them as being too right, and then people on the right see them as being too left. The whole oil thing is a very good example. In fact, you could really argue that an awful lot of Canadian politics just revolves around the oil industry these days. On the right, Justin Trudeau is very much associated with the kind of fanatic anti-oil extremism, a man who literally wants to destroy the Canadian oil industry in the name of all of his woo-woo environmental theories, put all of the hard-working blue-collar oil workers out of a job. But then on the left, you have people that argue, no, he's actually not destroying the Canadian oil industry fast enough. A good example was the Kinder Morgan Corporation's plan to expand this oil pipeline that brings oil from Alberta to the Pacific coast. Trudeau's government bogged the project down with so many regulations that eventually the company just walked away. But then Trudeau's government swooped in and nationalized it to ensure it could continue. And now the left-wingers have made "you bought a pipeline" into one of their go-to insults. So it was kind of a bizarre compromise that pleased no one in an effort to please everyone.
Alors, le Parti conservateur du Canada, c'est le seul parti de droite du Canada. Enfin, plus maintenant avec le Parti populaire, mais bon. Bon, alors je crois pas que c'est un secret pour personne que je m'identifie pas trop idéologiquement au conservatisme et à la droite. Je crois pas que tes richesses et tes biens sont représentatifs de l'effort que tu mets dans ton travail. Je crois donc en l'importance d'avoir des régulations pour les entreprises, d'avoir un État-providence solide et un bon filet social. Toutes des choses pour lesquelles les conservateurs et la droite en général se battent pas tellement. Bon, alors pas mal toute ma jeunesse, j'ai grandi avec le gouvernement conservateur de Stephen Harper et c'était de la calice de marde.
It's how left-wingers talk about the greatest prime minister in Canadian history.
Le gouvernement actuel d'Andrew Scheer, je l'aime pas beaucoup, il reconnaît pas l'urgence climatique, il veut la création d'un pipeline de pétrole partout au travers le Canada et il est même pas fermé à l'idée, en tout cas, d'obliger sa construction sur les territoires du Québec, même si, depuis toujours, le Québec s'oppose à ce projet-là. Et pour justifier ça, Andrew Scheer utilise l'argument qu'apparemment le Québec achèterait du pétrole d'Arabie Saoudite, ce qui est complètement faux. Le Québec achète zéro pétrole d'Arabie Saoudite, fait que va chier, mon cher Andrew.
I actually agree with Thomas that this is a pretty stupid idea that the Conservatives are pushing. The proposal, the so-called Energy East initiative, is this plan to build a gigantic pipeline from Alberta all the way to Quebec. Supposedly, this is supposed to help make Canada more energy independent and make the Quebecers not be quite so hostile to the Canadian oil industry, which some would argue they do not presently appreciate enough, being so far away from it. But as Thomas says, this whole idea that Quebec is somehow too dependent on scary foreign oil is a bit of a myth. The vast majority of their oil already comes from either Canada or the US, with only about 20% coming from OPEC nations, mostly Algeria. While I do care about the survival of the Canadian oil industry, I also resent how increasingly it seems like sucking up to big oil is like the only unifying principle animating the Canadian conservative movement these days.
Andrew Scheer veut financer le troisième lien, qui est un pont entre Québec et Lévis. Ça, un peu de contexte derrière ça, c'est un projet de construction de pont qui est très controversé ici au Québec, puisque pour beaucoup de personnes, face à l'urgence climatique, la solution, c'est pas de construire plus de ponts pour plus de véhicules sur les routes, mais plutôt de travailler dans les transports collectifs. À la base, l'objectif de ce pont-là, c'est de réduire le trafic dans la ville de Québec, mais il y a des études qui sont sorties qui ont dit que la construction d'un pont, ça serait inefficace pour essayer de régler ce problème-là. Bref, c'est un enjeu très populiste et Andrew Scheer essaie manifestement de sécuriser quelques circonscriptions chez mes chers amis de la ville de Québec en leur promettant leur fameux pont de marde.
Okay, so two things here. One, do you notice how the things that bother Thomas often seem to involve the federal government getting involved in some very narrowly specific Quebec thing? That is very Quebec. In the rest of Canada, people do not tend to view federal politics through the lens of their province to nearly the same degree. Like, I can't imagine the federal government's decision to support the building of a particular bridge here in British Columbia being something that I would ever have as strong an opinion on, one way or the other, as Thomas does here. But that relates to point number two, which is that I think it is now quite obvious that Thomas is somebody that takes climate change very seriously. And the way he talks about it makes me very aware of a sort of generation gap on this issue. Like, I'm 35, and if I recall correctly, Thomas is about 10 years younger. And what I have really started to notice lately is just how people in their early 20s have so much more acute anxiety and passion for this issue than even people in their early 30s do. Like, even the way he says things like climate emergency, I just don't feel like I very often meet people my own age who use that kind of language, unless they're running for something. I don't know, maybe I'm just living in a bit of a right-wing bubble, or I'm just getting very complacent as I get older. I do care about climate change, but I just have a hard time relating to the kind of passion that would see the construction of a bridge as like a critical issue in a national election.
Bon, aussi, pour les conservateurs, l'avortement, c'est un peu une zone floue. Bon, Andrew Scheer est contre le droit à l'avortement, mais il a dit qu'il n'allait pas déposer de loi pour réformer l'accès au droit à l'avortement. Sauf qu'il a également dit qu'il n'empêcherait pas ses ministres de déposer des projets de loi par rapport à une réforme quant à l'avortement. Donc, un peu shady.
Man, you know, abortion continues to be such a big issue in Canadian politics, even though there has been an all-party consensus for the last 30 years to never regulate abortion in any way. The Conservatives swear up and down that they will never, ever, ever, ever pass any laws about abortion in any context ever, and yet they still rely on pro-life votes to get elected because there are millions of Canadians who are not satisfied with the status quo of no regulations at all. So Scheer has to do the bare minimum to appease the pro-lifers. In fact, every subsequent Conservative Party leader tends to make the bare minimum smaller and smaller and smaller. At present, Scheer says that even though he will move heaven and earth to quash any pro-life legislation that emerges from the Parliament, he will not personally oppose any individual member of Parliament who chooses to waste their time proposing pro-life legislation, which people on the left in turn demonize as proof he has a secret plan to criminalize abortion. Like, literally, this whole stupid debate has been like one of the top 3 things we have spent time talking about in this campaign.
Bon, aussi Andrew Scheer C'est fou comme il est plate, là. Non seulement il est plate, mais aussi il manque comme il respire, hein. Genre, récemment, il a publié un communiqué de presse disant que Trudeau avait trompé sa femme quand il était prof, ce qui est faux.
That is not true, Thomas. The Conservative Party merely issued a press release implying that Trudeau had lost his teacher job